begin this service, this gathering, it was about 2 years ago, Stephanie and I were at church planting assessment with Converge, and to get the picture of what that looks like, there were about 14 of us prospective church planters that went to this 5-day kind of, it's almost like an interview, really difficult process, fun process, but at the end of it, they say there's a team that says, yes, we think you can plant a church, no, we don't think you can. And so we went through that, and out of that time, we just had this dream, this vision, this desire, this passion, this belief that we wanted to see another church started. And at the time, we weren't even necessarily, we didn't necessarily know we would be in Muskegon. We thought, yeah, Muskegon, Norton Shores could use another church. But the question of why start another church really gets down to vision. And I believe that God wants to see more people come to know Jesus. We look around this world and there's so much hurt, and there's so many people who are struggling. And the reality of the good news of Jesus is that there is hope. There's new life, a better life in a relationship with Jesus. And so that vision is why we're doing what we're doing. That's why we're starting this church. And that's why we keep pressing forward even when it's difficult. As we walk into this series, we are talking about this reality that we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. When we receive the love of God, it should cause us to love others. I just wonder, if Christians were known for this, if this is when the first thing that people who are far from God thought of about Christians, that they love their neighbor better than anyone else. Can you imagine how different that would be than how some people think of Christians today? Like, this is what God wants for us. Again, when we say we want to help hurting people find hope and healing in Jesus, it's possible when we love our neighbor as ourselves. Back in probably 2012, I had heard this quote, these two questions about churches. And the first question is this: if your church stopped existing today, would anybody in the community notice? And then the follow-up question is, would they care? And that question really, it shook me. It changed the way I thought about church, because I realized this is what churches should do, is they should make a positive impact in the community. That if the church were to be gone, the surrounding area would be like, oh, we miss that place. It was such a blessing to those around us. Like, that's what the church is meant to do. And so it started changing how I did ministry. I started to do more and more things outside of the church building and in the community. And in a lot of ways, that's what pushed me towards wanting to start a church. But today I want us to take that question and kind of flip it around, or maybe flip it to ourselves a little bit more. And think about it this way. If you stopped living in your neighborhood, or if you no longer went to your place of work, or the place where you do hobbies, maybe it's your golf course, or the place where you knit, or whatever, if you stopped going to those communities, one, would people notice, and two, would they miss you? Because I think that's a good mark of knowing, are we living into this command, this call that God has for us to love our neighbor as ourselves? The result of being loved by God should push us to loving others. When we are loved by God, it should make us love others. We should be the best at loving others. That's what Jesus' vision for his people is that we would love others. See, I talked about a vision for a church earlier, that we would help hurting people find hope and healing in Jesus. But Jesus has a vision for us. Jesus' vision for us is that we would love others. And so today, this is kind of our big point. Jesus wants us to receive his love, God's love, and he wants us to share it with our neighbor. That's what God's vision is for our life is that we would take the love that God has for us, would receive it, and that we wouldn't hang on to it for ourselves, that it would overflow, that it would spill into others' lives. So there's a couple kind of warnings or thoughts that I have on this. That the first one is this: if we are not loving our neighbor, we're just playing religion. If we're going to church, we're doing all the religious things, and it doesn't cause us to love God, that's an empty religion. That's not a relationship with Jesus. God has more in store for us than to just go to church and not have that change our lives, not make a better impact on others. The second thing is this. Following Jesus can't be done outside of community. It can't be done outside of relationships. If you're going to follow Jesus the way that Jesus wants you to follow him, it will require that you have relationships in your life, that you'll make impact on those around you. You will know you're following Jesus if you are making an impact on those around you. Like, that's what God has in store for us. That's God's call for us. So when we think about Jesus' vision for us, which I already said is to love those around us, to receive his love and share it with our neighbor, this is what it'll look like. Jesus points us to the main thing. Loving God leads to loving others. Loving God leads to loving others. And we see this in what's called the Great Commandment. In Matthew's one of the 4 gospel writers in the New Testament. The Bible's 2 halves, the Old Testament, New Testament. And one of those 4 gospel writers, there's 4 people that talk about Jesus' life. That's called a gospel writer. And they're the first 4 books of the New Testament. One of them's name is Matthew, and he kind of records Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection. And in it, there's this account that takes place where Jesus is asked this. So there's kind of some question and answers setting up the table for verse 34, and Jesus has already answered some really tough questions really well. And that's where we take in verse 34. It says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees because of his answers, the Pharisees, another group of religious leaders, got together. One of them, being an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the laws and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. So this was a normal practice in the day when Jesus lived in Israel. People would want to understand the law, which is the Old Testament law, especially the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so they would ask this question, what's the greatest commandment? Of all the Old Testament, there's so many commandments, like 613 commandments. What is the greatest of them? And so people would kind of struggle with them. It was kind of a way to show what is the main belief of this teacher. And a lot of times people would choose either to say love the Lord your God, or they would choose love your neighbor. Both of those are commandments from the Old Testament. But Jesus, as a few other people were answering, he combines the 2 together. He says they're both important. He says, loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, basically with all of your person, every single fiber of your being, that is the most important. But then he says, the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so what Jesus is doing is he's tying these 2 together. He says, you first have to love God with all your being. But if you're loving God, you're going to love your neighbor as yourself. Like, this is a beautiful command. Like, if we were known for this, like, we would be the type of people that others would want to be around us. This is what it means to be human, is to be in deep relationships with other people, to love God and to love others. And this is God's vision for our life. This is Jesus' vision for our life, that we would receive love from God and share it with others. But again, in order to live out this second part of this commandment, this second command that Jesus said is so important, to love your neighbor as yourself, you have to have neighbors in your life. You can't love your neighbor if you don't know your neighbor. You can't love your coworker if you don't know your coworker. You can't love those who are in the places where your hobbies. Like, you can't love them if you don't know them. And so this is the call, is that when we receive the love of God, we need to share it with those around us. Like, we are expected as Jesus followers to have relationships with those around us. And if we don't have relationships, we need to build them. And that, I think that's kind of that first part of that question that I mentioned at the beginning. If your church, or if you stopped existing in the context that you're in, would you be noticed? And sometimes we're not noticed because we're not making an impact. Sometimes we're being noticed, and it's not in a good way. And that means that God's love isn't flowing into us and flowing out into others. We need to make a positive impact on the community around us. This summer, we're going to be using an acronym called BLESS, and it helps us to find practical ways to love those around us. Sometimes we need some coaching. Sometimes we need some training to get better at loving those. But notice that this is very tangible and practical. Jesus wants our life to make an impact on those around us. God transforms my life through his love for me, and then that transformation is supposed to help those around us. That's the beauty of God's commandment. And this has always been God's plan. God has always desired for his people to share his love with other people. Like, that's what God's love is meant to make an impact on those around us. This wasn't, when Jesus says this isn't something like brand new that God just simply thought up that day. Again, this is centered in the Old Testament. And we talked about how love the Lord your God with all your heart. That's the first thing Jesus said. That's a quote of Deuteronomy 6. And so when Jesus was forming the nation of Israel, his chosen people, he said, look, this is what you need to do. You need to love God. You need to follow his command. You need to teach others to do this command. And in the same way, loving other people wasn't new either. Jesus had called for his people to do that. And so we're going to look at Leviticus, which I've never preached on Leviticus. I don't think I've ever preached on Leviticus before. But Leviticus has all these rules and all these regulations. And in Leviticus 19, verse 2, God says to his people, be holy because I'm holy. So be set apart, set me in front, have me as the standard. And then in verse 4, he says, don't have any idols. So again, that's kind of connecting to Deuteronomy 6 of love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Like, keep God centered. Keep God holy. But what does that holiness look like? When we are loving God, it doesn't just stop there. It's supposed to impact people. And that's what we're going to pick up here in Leviticus 19. So Leviticus 19, verse 9. When you reap the harvest of your land, remember I said this is going to get really practical. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not deceive one another. Do not swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so that you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people. But, here it is, love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So all these commands, these are very relationally centered. You can see God is saying, God's first said, love God, be loved by God, and then that love should impact the way you love others, the way you treat others. And it starts with this idea of, we saw it, when you're doing your work as a farmer, you're harvesting your fields. And he says, don't go over every single piece of your field. When grapes fall down to the ground, don't pick up. Don't try to get every single thing you can out of it. The reason why is that there were poor people in the community around, and the common practice was to glean, to go in after the crop has been harvested, and those who were less well off could get enough to sustain them through life. That's a loving neighbor. And that's what God has for us. Maybe the way that we can think of this is, are we having margin in our life? Are we not trying to squeeze out every little piece of our life, but instead leaving some room for others? That's one way that we can make sure that we are loving our neighbor. God says, make sure you're leaving enough for your neighbors. Make sure you have enough room for them. Then God says these very practical things. He's like, hey, don't lie to your neighbor. Don't steal from your neighbor. Don't slander them. Don't defraud them. Don't talk bad about a deaf person who can't hear what you're saying and defend them. As someone with vision problems, I kind of like this one. Like, don't put a stumbling block and try to trip up those who are visually impaired. Like, that's a pretty good rule, right? Like, all these things, he's saying, love those who are around you. He even says, hey, don't just, like, when someone hurts you, don't just ignore it. Sometimes you got to confront them in a loving way. He's saying, have great relationships with those around you. But I want to go back to this part of the how they would harvest the field. And he's saying, leave margin in that field. That's one way to love God. And so what does that look like for us? Because most of us aren't farmers, and most of us aren't trying to leave extra grain or grapes in the field. But when I think of margin, I think of time, talent, treasure. Okay? So we have time, we have different gifts, and we have some money and resources. And so we could use every little aspect of our time, talent, and treasure for ourselves. Or we could make sure that we're setting aside, you can do this assessment of yourself. Am I leaving enough time to make an impact on those around me? Am I setting aside some resources so I can help those around me? Could I maybe have some money to take someone on to do a fun activity, to kind of build those relationships? That's some of the practical ways that we can apply this idea to love your neighbor. And the cool thing about this is it can be fun. It can be a good thing. It's usually something we enjoy. During COVID, when everything was shut down, we ended up getting a Traeger, a smoker. And one of the things that so Stephanie loves ribs. She had been gluten-free. We found that about 10 years ago, and so she ended up eating ribs. And so ribs is not something you can do real easy as a takeout. And so we weren't able to go on spring break like we had wanted, and we're like, hey, this would be a fun thing to do. So we got the smoker. And one of the awesome things about it is we ended up having neighbors over quite a bit and sharing ribs with them. And this is just a practical way of okay, here's how you can build some relationships with people. And we've had so many meals with other people since that time. That's been a way that we've used the resources that we have to love those around us. So those are the types of things I want you to think about is what's the time that you have? What are the treasures that you are having? What's the talent that you can find practical ways to love your neighbor? This is what it looks like to follow God and to listen to him and to make a positive impact on those around you. But the reality is, people can be really difficult, right? And I know this because I know myself and how I interact with others. It can be difficult to be around any person because we are all flawed people. We still have that brokenness in our life. We still hurt one another's. And so there's this truth that we have to stay connected to Jesus in order to love difficult people. If we are going to love our neighbor, even the ones that are hard for us to love, we have to stay closely connected to Jesus. You're going to have difficult people in your life. I'm going to have difficult people in my life, and it gets really challenging to continue to love those around us. But we've seen Jesus has this vision. It's like, what does a Jesus follower look like? It's someone who receives God's love and shares it to those around us. But that's only possible if we stay connected to God. And Jesus makes this pretty clear to us. Shortly before Jesus died, he was teaching to his followers. And so it's kind of the end of the 3 years that he had spent discipling his followers, teaching them how to live the life that God wants them to live the life that Jesus has, not only for his disciples, but for us. And he says this in John 13, 34 and 35. He says, "A new command I give to you, love one another," which it's not new in the sense that it's divorced, separated from everything else, but he's saying this is the emphasis. "A new command I give to you, love one another. As I have loved you, you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." So Jesus is saying, here's my command. Love those around you. And he's talking first to the disciples. So what does this mean for us? First, we love those who are in our life. We love if we're a Jesus follower, we love those who are following Jesus. Love one another. We love other disciples. But how do we do that when people are difficult? How do we do that when people hurt us? How do we do that when people don't treat us fairly? How do we do this when people bug us or annoy us? Jesus says, as I have loved you, you must love one another. How has Jesus loved us? Well, in Romans 5:8 it says, God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus gave up his entire life for us. So I can probably put up with some people who are hard to get along with, who are annoying or talk bad about me. Like, as God has loved me, I'm called to love others. And that starts in our family. It starts in the closest relationships we have. So we're going to forgive others as Jesus has forgiven us. We're going to bear with others as Jesus has forgiven us and bared with us. Right? The way that Jesus has loved us should cause us to love those around us. By this, people will know that we are Jesus followers. This is what it looks like. We've looked at this throughout the past year, that Jesus' heartbeat is not just for those who are already in his family, in his community. Jesus is known as one who goes after those who are far from God. Jesus came, one parable says, he says that a doctor doesn't come for the healthy people, but for the sick. Like, Jesus came for those who are broken and messy and their life isn't all together. Jesus came for the people that don't even believe in God, people that hate God. Jesus came for those people. And so as a church, as Jesus followers, we got to love everyone. Like, who is it that's the most difficult person for you to love? God wants you to love them. Who's that person that's hard for you to love in your life? God calls us to love them. And how do we do it? We remember how Jesus has loved us. Just as he loved us, so we must love one another. As you look around your life, your community, with people in your family, starting in your home, in your neighborhood, your coworkers, the people that you hang out with during your free time, like, these are the people that God's already placed in your life. And Jesus' vision is like, this is what the world should look like. Love one another. Have deep relationships with one another. God's vision for his church, for his people, for you and me, is not that we would be monks who separate ourselves from all community, but instead that we would learn to receive Jesus' love and share that with those around us. This is such a big vision from Jesus. It's worth starting more churches. It's worth talking to people who don't believe in God and share. This is why we want to do this. If we practice this, the world would be a better place. So we need to receive Jesus' love. We need to share that love with your neighbor. I don't know about you. If you're someone who doesn't yet know Jesus, if you're someone who doesn't yet believe in Jesus, I really do believe that there has been, in the past, I don't know, 5, 10, 20 years, a very bad representation of Jesus by so-called Jesus followers. And if that's something that's like turned you off towards God, I want to just say I'm sorry, because this is not what God has called for us to do. And the other reality is we are all broken sinners. I'm a broken sinner that needs the love of Jesus. But I want you to see Jesus' very words. Like, what is Jesus' vision for his people? It's that Jesus followers would be the best neighbors ever. That they would share love more than ever. And so if you've been like frustrated by Christians before, just make sure you're looking to Jesus' call, not the bad experiences that you've had. But if you're someone who's been following Jesus for a while, and you get to that spot and it's really difficult to love people in your life, like maybe you've been trying and you're just burnt out and you're kind of at that red line, like realize you need to go back and receive Jesus' love. You can't do it on your own. My love is not that great. Jesus' love is amazing. It's Jesus' love that the world needs more of, not my love, not your love. And as we receive the love of Jesus, then we have something good to share. That's how we can be the best neighbors ever. So as we close this morning, I want to just encourage you to look around your life and just maybe begin asking God, who is it that's already in my life that you want me to share your love with? Because that's how practical this is that we can make an impact when we receive and share Jesus' love. And again, that's where we're going to be using this bless tool to help us to see those people who are around us and figure out ways that we can make an impact by sharing Jesus' love with the community. Can you see it? Can you see how much better this world would be if we as believers live this out? If we as the church live this out? This could make an impact. We say it all the time that Norton Shores is a hurting community with hurting families and hurting individuals. But the good news of Jesus brings hope and healing to individuals. It brings transformation to families. It's how the community will be restored. And it starts by receiving and sharing Jesus' love, one person at a time. We can do this together. I'm going to pray, asking God to give us the power to do this. God, we love you, and we believe in you and your call for us to share this love to the people in our life. I ask that you will help us to make a real impact in the lives of those around us. But we need your love to do this. So strengthen us with your love and let us share that with those around us. We